In this history lesson, we're going to look at how Simon de Montfort changed the way England was ruled. Now, this continues from the work we've been doing on King John. You'll remember King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta because the barons were not happy with him. They were angry at the way in which he was ruling the country. And so they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. And this was the barons taking charge of the country, or taking more control over the way in which the king was running the country. Now, Simon de Montfort, he was also a baron. So this is another example of the barons taking charge. So just to recap, do you remember, or you should remember, learning about the feudal system with Mr. Collard in Year 6? The feudal system is the hierarchy of people in the country. Obviously, at the top, the most important person in medieval times was the king, and then underneath him were the barons, or the nobles, which would have included lords and barons. And then underneath that, we have the knights. And then at the bottom of the ladder, the least important people in society were the peasants, or the commoners. And so this is going to be important as we continue this lesson, because when King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, this was the first example of barons challenging the power that the king had. So they were unhappy with the way the king was running the country. So they forced him, they rose up against him, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, the big, great charter, which said that he no longer could just do whatever he wanted. He had to consult with the barons first. And today we're going to look at a second example of the barons challenging the power of the king. And as I've mentioned before, the leading baron in this event was a baron called Simon de Montfort. So, a little warm-up activity. Take a look at these two pictures. Okay, the first is a picture from medieval times, and the second is a photograph from the BBC News. And I'd like you to note down, so pause this video and just jot down a couple of similarities that you can see in the two pictures, and perhaps one or two differences. Pause the video and make your notes. Okay, so hopefully you've got a few things jotted down in front of you. I have highlighted with this blue circle here, this figure here. So in both of these pictures, you have a person looking in charge, sat on a throne, and very much in charge of the proceedings, or watching over what is going on around him. And the other similarity that I've highlighted with these red arrows are these rows of people who are there watching what's going on. Okay, so these are both examples of Parliament, and the key difference is that this first picture is from 1295, and the second picture is from just last year in 2019. So this is evidence of one of the first ever parliaments, and what is fascinating is that it is something which still occurs in England today. So here we have Parliament sitting and our current Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking at Parliament. Okay, so we're going to find out all about the origins of Parliament. Now, remember, King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. This image here of the king, this is King John, really portrays or depicts that he was not seen or rated very highly. Look at him there on his throne. His shawl or gown is coming off his shoulder. He looks a bit disheveled. His crown is on one side. So he's really not looking very regal. He's really depicted as a king who is not very good. And also, you'll note that the picture behind him is the church. So the church was behind him. He was not. He lost favour with the church, and he upset the monks, and that's depicted in this painting here of King John. So the Magna Carta had resulted in the creation of a council of barons. The king could no longer do as he pleased, and he had to consult with the barons first. However, in 1216, King John suddenly died, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to rule the country. So in sharp contrast to this dishevelled picture of King John, we have a new, brighter picture of King Henry III. Now this time, he's only a boy. He's a young 9-year-old, but he is sitting on a big throne. The throne rises up behind him. He has 2 bishops either side of him who are holding on or placing on his crown nice and straight. So he is approved of by the bishops, and he is cradling in his hands the church, which implies that at the time people felt that he was going to be a much better king and work more closely with the church. People's hopes were up that this was going to be an improvement on the previous king, King John. So King Henry, well, yes, to begin with, he regularly met with the Great Council and he took advice from the barons. Remember, he was only young, so he did as he was told to begin with. But Henry didn't stay a boy forever. And when he got older and he got married, he began to ignore the advice of the barons and started to run the country the way he wanted to. So remember his father had the nickname Soft Sword because he was not very good in battles and he lost land. Well, King Henry wanted to regain some of the land, and so one of the things he did was he agreed to buy the island of Sicily from the Pope. But that didn't make him very popular at all with the barons because Sicily was a long, long way away from England, and they felt he could not afford it. It put him into lots of debt. So this angered the barons. He also was accused of favouring his French relatives. So his wife was French, and he was taking advice from his French relatives and giving them jobs. And the barons were not impressed with that either. So those 2 things were 2 of the major things which angered the barons. So history is starting to repeat itself here because the barons are getting angry with the king. And by 1258, the barons had had enough. So this is where Simon de Montfort comes in. Simon de Montfort led this group of angry barons, and they met in Oxford to discuss Henry III and how they weren't impressed with the way in which he was ruling the country. And the meeting there in Oxford was called a parliament. Now, you'll obviously have all heard the word parliament. It comes from the French word parler, which means to talk. So the meeting was a parler. They were there to talk, and it became known as Parliament. But they didn't just talk at this meeting in Oxford. They wrote a document which is known as the Provisions of Oxford. And the Provisions of Oxford, as you can see here in source B, said that the king cannot make decisions without the Great Council's agreement. It said the Great Council should choose the king's main advisors, and it said that a parliament consisting of 15 members of the Great Council plus 12 other barons has to meet at least 3 times a year. And as you can see, this document gave the barons a lot more power. But obviously, when they met and they got the king there, they didn't really give the king any choice, so that King Henry would have had no choice but to sign it. So he had to sign the Provisions of Oxford, which really limited the amount of power he had and gave more power to the barons, just as the Magna Carta had done previously with his father. Now, Henry obviously wasn't too happy with the Provisions of Oxford, but had to go along with it. But after a few years, he managed to persuade the Pope to cancel the oath he'd made to follow the provisions. Obviously, this angered some of the barons, and Simon de Montfort rose up, and in 1264, he led a rebellion against Henry III at Lewes in Sussex. So there was a battle and the barons won, and King Henry was taken prisoner. So for this short time, while Henry was in prison, Simon de Montfort actually ruled England. Now, many of the barons in the Parliament actually became unhappy that Simon de Montfort was acting as king. So they didn't like the fact that he had sort of risen up and taken charge. So Simon de Montfort called a meeting of the Great Council in 1265. And this is an important bit. He invited people from lower down the feudal system. So he invited some commoners, which would have been wealthy people from the towns, to come along to the Great Council. And he did this because he believed that against the barons, as he'd lost popularity with many of the barons, this would give him more support. So these people were called commoners, and his parliament, his great meeting, his great council, his parliament included barons, 2 knights from each county, and also 2 wealthy people from each town. And this is reflected still today in our Parliament, because we have the House of Lords, but we also have the House of Commons. Now, sadly, King Henry's son, Edward, obviously was unhappy that his father was in prison. Edward was also captured, but he managed to escape. He swore revenge. So he gathered together an army, and in August 1265, he defeated Simon de Montfort's army at the Battle of Evesham. And this source here, this drawing or illustration, shows the rather nasty way in which Simon de Montfort was killed. It says the death of Simon de Montfort, here looks a bit like a cartoon strip. First, de Montfort is stripped of his armour, then his body is cut into pieces, and later his head was sent to a man who hated him as a present. A really rather brutal death. And if you want to find out more about the way in which he died, Mr. Collard loves to retell that story. Okay, so although Simon de Montfort has died, the key thing is his idea lived on. When Henry II died, Henry III, died in 1272, Prince Edward became King Edward I. He didn't want to risk any more fights with the barons by scrapping Parliament, so he kept meeting with them. And by the mid-1300s, meetings of Parliament had settled into a pattern that has lasted for centuries. The British Parliament, made up of the Houses of Lords and the House of Commons, still meets like this today, as you can see back in that original picture. Okay, so having listened to the lesson, it's now over to you. It's time to think about and write about the information you've heard. So go back to your slides. This is on slide 12, and click on the link and complete the comprehension. You obviously have copies of all the slides I've talked through, so you can go back and look at them at any time to get more information. When you complete your comprehension, I've left you long answer spaces for each question. A satisfactory answer would just be a short answer with one or two words, like Simon de Montfort or Parliament. But what I'm looking for is really good answers. So I don't want you to just write short one or two words. I want you to write your answers in full sentences and to use information from the text to explain your answer. So really go for it with these answers. Okay, so I think at that point it's over to you. There is an extension task to find out more about the Houses of Parliament for those of you that have got more time and want to push yourselves further. Enjoy.